The movie begins with a group of astronauts on the International Space Station getting ready to catch the Pilgrim, a satellite capsule coming back from Mars. The Pilgrim is carrying Martian soil samples, which the astronauts hope will prove the existence of life on Mars. Their main goal is to intersect the Pilgrim and determine if life could exist on Mars. Unfortunately, the Pilgrim gets damaged and goes off track. Rory gets ready for a spacewalk, where he'll be outside the space station using a mechanical arm to grab the Pilgrim. His teammates assist him in preparing for his task. The space station is filled with tension as the astronauts move around the station, quickly getting to their positions. Their leader, Ekaterina, and another astronaut, Sho, are in the station's control center supervising the operation. The other astronauts watch closely as the station positions itself to catch the Pilgrim. David, the station's medic, keeps an eye on Rory's health signs. He and the head scientist, Hugh, watch Rory from a window. The station is filled with anxiety as they finally see the Pilgrim capsule coming closer. Rory moves the arm into place, and as the Pilgrim comes in and makes contact, the whole station shakes. The astronauts are pushed back, but when they get back to the window, they see Rory has grabbed the Pilgrim. They cheer and smile as Ekaterina tells NASA that the Pilgrim capsule has successfully landed on the station. In the lab, Hugh carefully takes samples from a container and puts them under a microscope. He finds an almost fossilized organism in the sample. He describes it as something like a single-celled organism. Hugh tries to revive the organism, but it doesn't respond. He then tries to recreate an atmosphere similar to early Earth and adds a growth hormone. To everyone's surprise, the organism starts to move. Hugh can't help but laugh, as they've confirmed life on another planet. The team later gets a call from Earth. News outlets and large crowds are celebrating the discovery of alien life. The astronauts talk with students, announcing that their school had been given a special opportunity to name the Martian. The kid announces that they decide to name the organism Calvin. After the call, the astronauts go back to their tasks. Hugh and Rory argue while trying to fix the plumbing. Meanwhile, another doctor, Miranda, checks on David's health. Miranda is worried because David had been on the station for a long time, almost breaking the world record for the longest time in space. David says he doesn't mind, as he prefers to stay on the space station. He feels like he fits in there. They continued testing the organism the next day. Hugh found that Calvin has grown quickly, now made up of hundreds of cells and developing a neural network. Hugh notes that each of Calvin's cells can perform all bodily functions independently, meaning each of Calvin's cells is at the same time a muscle cell, a nerve cell, and a light-sensitive cell. Calvin is a creature that is all brain, all muscle, and all eyes. Calvin has also grown appendages, and Hugh tries to make contact. The crew watches nervously as Hugh interacts with the alien creature. The crew later has dinner while Sho calls his wife, who's currently giving birth. Sho then introduces everyone to his newborn daughter. The crew then goes to their quarters, each taking care of themselves. David checks himself for injuries and illnesses. Sho continues his call with his family. Hugh is back in the lab, interacting with Calvin. Several weeks pass, and the station is shaken by an alarm. Roy, Miranda, and Hugh all hurry to the lab. Rory goes in and corrects the malfunction, and Hugh confesses he must have missed something for the lab to malfunction. Miranda emphasizes the need to keep Calvin contained, as they don't fully understand it yet. But Hugh is annoyed, saying they shouldn't compare Calvin to a disease. But Rory gets irritated, saying that Calvin is an alien species, and that Hugh shouldn't get too attached. Later, Miranda notes that Calvin has now become dormant after weeks of continuous growth. They suspect that Calvin may have gone into hibernation as a defense mechanism when the lab malfunctioned. She says she's relieved as the creature is growing too quickly. This pause in its growth has given her and the crew time to review their containment procedures. Calvin and the lab must remain sealed off at all times. Miranda states that the health of everyone on board far outweighs any harm to Calvin. Hugh discusses Calvin with Miranda. He emphasizes the importance of their mission and studying Calvin's cells. He suggests that Calvin could unlock the secret to curing any disease, or potentially healing every ailment. He proposes giving Calvin a small electric shock to wake him up. In the lab, Hugh prepares to shock Calvin. After several shocks, Calvin wakes up, latching onto Hugh's hand and breaking the electric wand. The crew tries to stay calm as Calvin grips Hugh's hand. Hugh tries pulling, but Calvin maintains a firm grip. Hugh starts screaming in pain as Calvin starts squeezing. Calvin begins bending Hugh's fingers into unnatural shapes, and Hugh starts pleading for help. The crew wants to go in and help, but Miranda tells them that they can't risk putting another crew member in danger. As the crew argues, Calvin breaks Hugh's hand. Hugh then starts floating, unconscious, his hand a twisted mess. In the container, Calvin tries to break free. It uses a piece of the broken electric wand to pierce one of the gloves. Calvin breaks free, leaving everyone in complete shock. Calvin makes its way to a lab rat specimen. It suddenly attacks, wrapping itself around the rat and digesting it. Rory enters the lab, fetching Hugh. David receives Hugh, but has to close the lab door before Rory makes it out, as he sees Calvin latch itself onto Rory's leg. Rory then gets an oxygen candle, hoping to burn Calvin off his leg. He burns Calvin, and it jumps off. Ekaterina then tells the others to kill the alien. Rory takes an incinerator and prepares to flame Calvin. He starts hunting the alien, bathing it with a flame. Calvin runs around the lab, hiding, but Rory chases after it. Rory corners the alien, believing he has Calvin trapped in a container. Rory discovers the container empty, and Calvin pops up behind him. The alien grabs Rory's face and makes its way into Rory's mouth. Rory begins choking, and the crew watches in horror, unable to help. A large amount of blood spews out of Rory's mouth as he floats lifelessly in the lab. The incinerator triggers a fire alarm, and fire-suppressing gas fills the lab. Calvin exits Rory, now appearing to have grown 100-fold. Sho and the commander try manually closing the gas, as Calvin could use the gas holes as a way out. As the final valve closes, Calvin reaches it and squeezes out. Ekaterina sends out a distress call to NASA, but Sho sees that the transmission has failed. They'd need to venture out to fix it. Ekaterina suits up and heads out. She reaches the transmitter and sees that it's overheated. She opens the cooling chamber and sees it empty. She surmises that Calvin could have reached the coolant. Hugh, now conscious, theorizes that Calvin may have consumed the coolant for sustenance. As they're talking, Calvin launches itself out of the coolant chambers and latches onto Ekaterina. Ekaterina makes her way back to the station airlock, but she notices liquid in her suit. Calvin has ruptured her coolant tube, and Ekaterina realizes that she could drown soon. Liquid begins to obstruct her sight, and she decides to jump for the airlock. Liquid coolant fills Ekaterina's helmet, and she starts to drown. David rushes to the airlock to meet Ekaterina, and Miranda cautions him that Ekaterina may be panicked and irrational. Ekaterina reaches the airlock, and David advises her to assist him in unlocking the airlock. To David's surprise, she starts turning the airlock's lever in the opposite direction. Miranda realizes that Ekaterina is intentionally locking herself out to protect the crew from Calvin. Ekaterina eventually drowns, and David and Miranda watch her drift away. Calvin jumps back to the ship, and David cries in frustration. Hugh tries to soothe everyone, telling them Calvin has been outside for too long for any creature to survive. Sho tells them Calvin could still enter the station through the thrusters. They monitor the thrusters, and each time a thruster experiences a temperature change, Sho ignites it. Unfortunately, all the thruster blasting causes the station to veer off, and Sho has to use the remaining fuel to put the station back in orbit. This allows Calvin to sneak back into the station. Hugh realizes that Calvin's species must have dominated Mars for millions of years, but went into hibernation when Mars' atmosphere collapsed. He suggests that they should stimulate the same on the station to force Calvin back into hibernation. They would retreat to one capsule, seal themselves off, and expel the oxygen from the rest of the station. They retreat to a capsule and seal everything off. Miranda notices Hugh getting weaker. Hugh blames himself for what happened, but David says it was a team decision to take Calvin. Hugh says Calvin is not their enemy, as he's only trying to survive, and for it to survive, it must kill them. Hugh gets weaker and passes out. The crew tries to help stabilize Hugh, but Miranda notices something moving in Hugh's leg. She unzips Hugh's pants and finds Calvin feeding on Hugh's leg. They all jump back. Miranda uses a defibrillator to shock Calvin, but it only catches the alien's attention. They rush out and get split up, and Sho gets stranded in the sleeping pods. David and Miranda return to Hugh, and David sees that Hugh will soon pass. David sees Calvin moving through the ship in a hologram. Calvin had accidentally swallowed Hugh's tracker, leaving Miranda and David with the ability to track the creature. They then lock themselves off and purge oxygen from the other compartments. Calvin starts suffocating when they suddenly get a proximity warning. They look out the window and see a Soyuz shuttle docking with the station. Miranda reveals that the Soyuz isn't there to rescue them, but to push them into deep space. It's a final security measure, ensuring no alien life would ever reach Earth. Believing the shuttle docking is a rescue mission, Sho leaves his sleeping chamber and rushes to the Soyuz. As he tries to get the hatch open, Calvin sneaks up behind him. Miranda and David hurry to Sho, but are too late. They see the cosmonauts inside the Soyuz getting devoured, and Sho is trying to make his way back out. The Soyuz breaks away, and the seal between the two stations fails. The station begins decompressing, and Sho starts getting sucked out. Calvin suddenly latches onto Sho's leg and starts climbing. As Calvin gets closer to Miranda, Sho decides to grab Calvin and allow himself to get sucked back. Sho falls and gets sucked into space, but Calvin manages to cling to the station. David helps Miranda climb up and manages to lock Calvin out. The station starts falling apart, and parts and debris fly everywhere. David sees that all the chaos has once again pushed the station into the Earth, leaving them about 30 minutes before the station re-enters the atmosphere. With depleting oxygen, David gets an idea. Calvin is searching for oxygen, so they could probably use the oxygen candles to lure it. He devises a plan to attract Calvin to one of the escape pods and propel himself into the vastness of space with Calvin. Miranda would then board on a different pod and return to Earth to inform everyone about what transpired. They put their plan into action, and David sets out with an oxygen candle. David cautiously navigates the station, and Calvin appears and clings to his oxygen candle. David escapes and uses another oxygen candle to entice Calvin. David reaches the escape pod, and Calvin rushes in and clings to him. Seeing that David has reached the pod, Miranda starts making her way to the other pod. David launches his pod, and he starts heading into the depths of space. Miranda then launches, and they begin to separate. In a black box recording, Miranda recounts what occurred at the station. She advises treating all Martian life as dangerous and hostile, and she recommends using all available means to eliminate Calvin if it ever arrives on Earth. Both capsules collide with debris, and both start to malfunction. Calvin grabs David's hand, but he does his best to keep his course. Miranda descends, but her pod's navigation systems start to malfunction. The two pods drift further apart. David screams in pain as Calvin wraps around his arm. One pod finally enters the atmosphere, while the other drifts off into space. The pod ends up crash landing in the ocean. Fishermen see the pod descending and approach it. In the pod, they see David covered in tendrils of flesh. In space, Miranda continues to drift off. The fishermen collaborate to open the pod, and David tries to dissuade them, but they can't understand him. More fishing boats approach the pod, unknowingly bringing themselves and the planet closer to their doom. And that brings us to the end of this movie recap. Honestly, I love this movie. It is one of the best alien movies out there. And if you agree with me, make sure you let me know in the comment section below. And hey, if you have a different opinion, I'd also love to hear your feedback in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. We want to make more videos like this for you, so make sure you're subscribed to our channel and that you click the like button on this video. If you know anyone else who'd be interested in this movie, make sure you send them this video. If you want to see another movie recap, then make sure you click that video that's on screen now, and I'll catch you in the next movie recap.